All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, depending on where you might be in the world. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's forum. My name is Alexander Cooley. I am a professor of political science at Barnard College here in New York. I also am the current director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, which is the oldest academic institute in North America dedicated to the study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. Today's special event on anti-corruption in Ukraine is a continuing commitment we have to both the country and the topic. We here at Harriman put on many events over the course of the year, even in this remote type of condition that we find ourselves in. But our commitment to Ukraine has been unwavering in terms of trying to understand the country, its traditions, its culture, its issues, its problems, its challenges. And that's something that we renew again here today. I should also mention that today's event is also being actively supported by the digital news organization EurasiaNet. And EurasiaNet has a special commitment to covering issues of corruption in the entire post-communist region. And if you look at their website, you will find an article from by Dan Pelishuk. That's a very nice primer for today. Ukraine's anti-corruption effort struggles, but soldiers on, where he takes stock and writes up some of the institutions that we will be discussing today. The particular series that this is part of is what we call Innovating Solutions to Systemic Corruption in Eurasia Forum. This was started by my co-chair, Matthew Murray, and I a couple of years ago, and it has a couple of purposes. We hear a lot about corruption in Ukraine, Russia, the former Soviet states. It's almost this constant stigmatization. One hears, we have to sort out the governance issues. Of course, the region is not unique in these types of challenges. What we hear less of are all of the innovations, institutions, efforts, and hardworking advocacy campaigns that ordinary citizens and also committed government officials undertake every day to improve conditions there. And many of them are truly novel. They are innovative. They are very contemporary. They make use of tools like technology and networks and citizens' motivations to improve their governance. And so the purpose of the forum, as well as the series that this is part of, is to highlight the positives of these efforts, to think about whether these could be models for other countries in other areas, and to really understand the positive that is right there alongside with the struggle for better governance, which is a struggle that we all share. So just in terms of a couple of ground rules and the format today, first of all, the webinar is divided into a part A and part B that has to do with just the volume of registrants that we have. So at 10:40, we will switch to a part B and we will put that in the chat. Second, Matthew and I really want to make this a forum that captures everyone's contributions. Our time today will be tight. I want to give everyone notice there. It would be wonderful if we could have substantive Q&A for each of our speakers because they are absolute experts. Unfortunately, we don't think we are going to have that kind of time to take extensive Q&A. But please, if you have questions, if you have comments, use the Q&A function and we will capture all of these. And if at all possible, we will pose questions. Also, because this is an attempt to create a network of committed cross-professionals, academics, journalists, policymakers, advocates, legal professionals in the study of anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy. If you have suggestions about readings, particular pieces of research, reports, feel free to paste them in the chat. And we will collect this material and include some of this in our write-up, and you'll be getting a summary report of some of the products and the fruits of our conversations. So our agenda today really is to learn. It is to learn about what is happening in Ukraine, to learn about each other and the work that we are doing, and to take this project forward into many more cycles. So without further ado, let me again just reiterate welcome to you all. I will now introduce my co-chair, Matthew Murray, who currently is also an adjunct professor of international public affairs at Columbia, where he has successfully taught a anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy course in Eurasia for us for the last 3 years. And it's been a tremendous addition to the curriculum and to the community. Matthew has extensive experience in so many different domains related to anti-corruption work, in government, in the executive branch, also as an advisor for both the private sector, as well as for advocacy groups operating in the region. He is a wealth of good judgment, as well as always brings positive energy and I think the necessary positive outlook to be engaged in this work. So Matthew, thank you again for your vision and your partnership here. Thank you all for joining, and I will turn over the moderating duties to you to engage with our first guest. Welcome again, everyone.
Thank you, Alex, and indeed, welcome everybody to this important event today, timely event today. And let me first say thank you to the Harriman Institute for being such an incredible, creative, historic resource for and providing the platform for this very important discussion, which is indeed designed purposefully to elevate our public debate around the best new approaches, the best practices for countering corruption in Eurasia and across the globe. It's my privilege to moderate the first session today, which is focused on the national security implications of corruption in Ukraine. And as Alex mentioned, this event is part of a forum that was founded in 2018 to address the correlations between globalization, transnational corruption, the rise of authoritarian states, and the decline of democracy. And our goal is first to examine cause and effect, to make the connections between these different global trends, and then second, to apply that analysis to innovate systemic solutions. And so today our focus is Ukraine, which has become ground zero in the growing conflict between the rise of authoritarian oligarchies and the challenge they're posing to rule of law-based democracies. And we are especially honored to have retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman as our first panelist today. Mr. Vindman is currently a doctoral student and fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's a military fellow at the Lawfare Institute, and he's a visiting fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to retiring from the Army, Mr. Vindman was the director of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Eastern Europe, and Russia rather, at the National Security Council. He also served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff and co-authored the National Military Strategy Russia Annex, and was the principal author for the Global Campaign for Russia. So Alex brings a particularly rich perspective as a soldier, a defense intellectual, and a policymaker to our discussion today. Welcome, Alex, and thank you for joining this forum.
Thank you very much. Defense intellectual, sometimes that's, some people might consider that an oxymoron, but let me start with thanking you, Matthew, Alexander, and the Harriman Institute for this invitation. It's a unique opportunity to be able to speak to a group of experts in a field that I would say I'm not super well versed in. Initially, I was a little bit puzzled about what I can contribute to a group of experts on anti-corruption, but once you get past that kind of initial hesitation, you realize the nexus between anti-corruption and national security and the vulnerabilities, both on the vulnerability side and the good governance side that enables prosperity. And it became a natural kind of opportunity to join this conversation and maybe contribute a little bit of.
So let's
thinking.
indeed. I mean, I think it's precisely because we are trying to mainstream this area of study that we are inviting people of different disciplines and experiences into the forum. And let me start there. Let me start where you just were taking us. The Biden administration recently issued the interim national security guidance, in which it warned that authoritarian states such as China and Russia are weaponizing corruption to weaken democracy and the rule of law. And this is a new national security threat for traditional defense analysts who are typically more focused on, the military threat that China may pose in the South China Sea or on Russia's violations of a nuclear arms control treaty. So what, as a national security expert who's worked in both the White House and the Pentagon, how do you generally assess the nature of this threat?
Yeah. That's interesting that it kind of this topic reached the level of this interim national security strategy. In fact, it's an old problem that has long existed. For those of you that are in the anti-corruption community, it's a long problem that has long existed, but is now kind of achieving a higher level of recognition as to the types of vulnerabilities it poses for struggling democracies, struggling governments, and opportunities it creates for authoritarian states that are seeking to coerce particular outcomes. And I would say for the expert community, the expert national security community, there is a general recognition of this feature, but it's not something that may have proliferated through the entirety of government. On this particular front, I would say that an examination of Russia and an examination of Ukraine would yield a one kind of maybe key and overriding conclusion that endemic corruption provides the government, provides the environment for Russia to claim Ukraine as a failed state, to apply all sorts of coercive tools, hybrid warfare, to solicit assets, to undermine perceptions of good governance amongst the Ukrainian population. And this was, in fact, one of the key opportunities that even the Trump administration, below the level of the president, unfortunately, was looking at with regards to collaborations with Ukraine. We had this whole idea of really energizing a couple of different activities, anti-corruption being one of the key activities, along with reforms to limit Russia's ability to influence domestic affairs in Ukraine, set the conditions for improved governance, improved services, improved investment, and thus prosperity to enable a successful Ukraine to emerge out of Russia's sphere of influence. So that's the way we were kind of looking at it amongst the expert community. But I would come back to the idea that that was not necessarily an idea that had quite as much heft and horsepower within the kind of the broader U.S. government that didn't really quite understand what was going on in Ukraine and Russia, or China and Ukraine for that matter.
And so sticking with that very important point that it's now in effect been elevated by being placed, at the top of the hierarchy of threats in this interim guidance, what do you see as the possible benefits of, let's say, putting more attention on this as a matter of bureaucratic necessity and imperative within the government? Do you think that will create, let's say, new analytics and a better understanding across government of this issue?
So analytics might be one of the benefits. I think I'll turn back to that one. I think the maybe the more key element here is signaling, and the idea that we're signaling that this will be an area that we want to work with the Ukrainians on. We want to work probably, with not just with the Ukrainians, but in this case, we'll just focus on Ukraine, and we're going to help nurture their fitful anti-corruption activities. We kind of instantiated that in terms of some of the sanctions that we've started to pursue with regards to Kolomoisky, Firtash and his network and so forth. But maybe even more importantly is the ability for corrupt networks to operate freely, whether that's in the United States or in the UK or in the West with regards to illicit finance. And I think that is one of the key things that we get a benefit from elevating anti-corruption. And we've been making progress in this regard already. Congress acted on some potent anti-corruption legislation. So now we're also including it in the interim national security guidance. I'm sure it'll fit prominently in in the national security guidance when it's completed. It'll fit into these reviews for Russia, China, and so forth. With regards to analytics, that's a slightly more challenging question for me because, frankly, I'm not sure if I fully understand, the competencies within government to study these corruption networks in detail. I could, at least in wave tops, I could kind of illuminate that we have pockets of expertise in Treasury and State Department in the intelligence community that look at corruption, look at kind of illicit finance networks, have a deeper understanding of how Russia and China operate, who their kind of counterparts are in Ukraine, and I think those folks probably have a relatively good set of analytical tools, but they're probably pretty. There might be a mile wide and an inch deep in terms of the fact that they have to cover a very large portfolio. And maybe I think another benefit is that if we elevate anti-corruption, we could apply some additional resources to this to further support analytics on the understanding that anti-corruption activities, fighting corruption is critical to enabling a lot of our national security objectives.
Thank you, Alex. It's very interesting perspective based on your experience inside government. Let's pull the camera back a bit and let's look at what you might call the size of the threat posed by transnational corruption in Ukraine. Last week, Deputy Secretary of State George Kent gave a speech before the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council. And he basically said that the internal threat posed by corruption is equivalent to the external threat posed by what Russia is currently doing on the border. And I realize that's a difficult comparison to make, but I would be interested in your view of that, and perhaps even more specifically, how you see these two threats being connected. How your opinion of the new generation warfare doctrine, and how it may integrate these two types of activities, military and non-military, in this case, weaponizing of corruption.
Sure. So first of all, George is terrific. He's brilliant, and I would concur with his general assessment. And I think I would say this, that the military threat on Russia's border is acute and immediate, but the equally important internal threat of corruption is probably one of the key elements that could undermine the viability of Ukraine's orientation towards the West, and this idea that Ukraine was moving away from the Russian sphere of influence, the way the Russians operate with their kind of endemic corruption, towards a Euro-Atlantic model of reformed government actually providing the kinds of goods and service, or the services that they need, the environment required for investment and prosperity. So I think that's probably what he was thinking, and I think that it's hard to dispute. And in a way, I think it's possible that Putin in his latest escalation recognizes that these efforts, both in terms of U.S. support and Zelensky in attacking some of the vested interests and pursuing an anti-corruption drive, also recognizes that this is a path to prosperity. And by escalating the situation on the border, it could be a distraction and a kind of a message to back off of those networks that Russia has in Ukraine, including kind of Medvedchuk, his access to, his ownership of key media interests and so forth. But to get to this idea of, the tie into hybrid warfare, I think it's part of a whole of government, whole of society approach to warfare that Russia has adopted. And we see that as at the very beginning of the war with regards to kind of leveraging corrupt networks to undermine the viability of the Ukrainian armed forces, the massive kind of erosion of confidence in the desertions in the Crimea Peninsula that amounted probably to more than 70% of the force structure deserting based on their holdings and possibly vulnerabilities, although it's unclear, to Russian corrupt networks. I think this is a key tool that the Russians employ to coerce individuals and states, and everything in between. And if we kind of look at it from that standpoint, it really substantiates George's idea that the internal threats are as important at times when the situation is probably not as acute on the border, maybe more important than what Russia is doing with kind of saber rattling on Ukraine's door. Yeah.
I find it particularly interesting that you make a connection between the decision, important decision recently made by President Zelensky to nationalize these media properties that were owned by, a well-known Russian-connected person operating in Ukraine, Medvedchuk, and the fact that in itself may have constituted it's hard to say exactly, but perhaps a trigger to Putin, that he wanted to show that he wasn't going to tolerate that level of political will being demonstrated by President Zelensky. Let's talk a little bit more.
I just put out a piece in Lawfare, that actually is significantly more robust on the bilateral relationship between Russia and China. And I definitely highlight this point that, the anti-corruption drive, the partnership between the emerging partnership between the U.S. and Ukraine do fit somewhere in Putin's calculus. So I guess if you're interested in that topic, there's an article on Lawfare that is extensive on this particular issue, although corruption, key part of it, maybe doesn't figure as quite as prominently.
Well, tell us more, if you will, about the content of that piece and the connection. Well, let me ask you the question this way. China is also cited in the new interim national security guidance. China has its own way of, let's say, bringing state capitalism to the global space and using it to undermine the sovereignty of foreign countries. It operates in a different way and at a different level, I would submit, than Russia in this particular area. Do you see them together trying to recreate a new way of economic interaction that's non-rules based and that is state controlled and driven? Do you see them, they're both doing it individually, but do you see them doing it together in some fashion?
I think that's an interesting idea, and I also kind of I've written on this a little bit also, and there's a there's a lack of clarity as to whether some of these activities are collaborative or this is just merely a convergence of tools, like the sharing of best practices amongst authoritarian states. And at minimum, you could certainly make a really quite strong claim. There is a sharing of best practices and a mutual toolkit. You see that kind of crossing various domains with regards to information operations. Especially in the COVID environment, I think China's adopted a lot more of Russia's toolkit with regards to these been called a fire hose of falsehoods approach. I think you do have this same thing in the corruption space with the sharing of best practices on. I don't know if they're sharing corrupt individuals. Hey, Misha over here is willing to take bribes. Go approach him to do whatever nefarious activity you want, from an economic benefit to kind of a political benefit. I'm not sure if that happens as much because I don't know if they want to share those kinds of assets per se, but they do kind of see how they operate effectively in the corruption space and attempt to learn from each other. We spent a lot of time talking about Russia and Ukraine. There was for Ukraine watchers, there was a lot of stories about Motor Siege and China's efforts through various enterprises attempting to gain control of Motor Siege, and ultimately President Zelensky, as we encouraged him during my tenure, ultimately ended up nationalizing Motor Siege to keep it out of the hands of the for two reasons. One is because we thought it would be good to keep it out of the hands of the Chinese, and I think he wanted to be helpful in that regard. But also importantly, the idea that there's the Chinese would pilfer the intellectual property from a Motor Siege. Motor Siege would potentially then dry up as a innovation and production capability for one of the preeminent kind of marquee companies for Ukraine, and then ultimately, frankly, even Russia could benefit from that. The adversary that Ukraine is facing at the moment could benefit from that because Russia still needs some of the equipment that Motor Siege provides. So I think it's an interesting idea, and this is the idea that authoritarian states see benefit in undermining a Western liberal order, operating in the same manner, sharing best practices, and ultimately there is cause to be concerned about convergence between Russia and China based on their mutual national security interests against the U.S., against the Western liberal order. These kinds of activities increasing, and the only natural conclusion is if they're converging, the democratic world also needs to converge in much the same way to push back on these kinds of tools and vulnerabilities. And that's certainly in the established democracies that are also falling victim: U.S., UK, France, Germany. That's in the struggling democracies that have vulnerabilities, and that's in the unrealized democracies that are fighting authoritarian regimes that are basically undergirded by corruption.
I think that's a great summary of how the nature and scope of this threat has become global and how it is leveraged by both China and Russia and actually other rising authoritarian states in different ways, and they're sharing best practices. And undoubtedly, as you've pointed out, one of those shared best practices is the use of state-owned enterprises to go into weak economies and try to dominate sectors, such as the manner in which China sought to take over Motor Siege. And of course, Russia is known for doing this across Ukraine and the former Soviet space with Rosneft, with Gazprom, with Rosatom, with other SOEs. So in the spirit of what you were just observing about how these networks have grown and expanded, and how the phenomenon of the rise of authoritarian states and their export of corruption is tied to the expansion of transnational networks. How comfortable do you feel that we as a government understand the size, the nature of these networks? I mean, we have to do something very similar with terrorist networks, don't we?
Yeah.
We have to be very specific about who's doing what and when and where. Is that the kind of level that we need to aspire to understand transnational corrupt networks that are surrogates for an aggressive foreign policy?
Yep. That's a very interesting question. I think, historically, certainly before, our Middle East wars, we would find little competency outside of law enforcement and outside of kind of niche capabilities in terms of tackling these types of issues. You've got the economy, the white economy, and then you have the black economy or the gray economy. And the folks that focus on that component traditionally are law enforcement. I think we learned a lot of lessons from our wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria about corruption backbones to finance some of these activities. So there are pockets of capability within DoD and within the intel community to understand transnational criminal networks. But in fact, almost a portion of any economy lays in the black or gray sphere, and that is the amount of resource that's applied to understanding and fighting corruption is probably not proportionate to the available resource as it exists. And there needs to be a lot more sinew and connection between the folks that cover nation state threats to the folks that kind of understand transnational criminal networks and corruption networks in order to really kind of address these issues. And we're not there yet.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so in other words, for example, we don't know who owns what part of we know part of that. We can see some of that, but we don't have the full database on who actually owns the economy that operates in the either black or gray zone. We don't certainly know who all the beneficial owners are, and therefore, how can we, as a country, understand how the political economy is really working on the informal side?
Yep.
And so, what you're saying is we need to, in effect, learn the lesson of the Middle East and Afghanistan. We need to learn to, let's say, bring law enforcement tools and metrics and data into the mainstream of national security assessment and investigation.
I think that's very true, and in a lot of ways, hybrid warfare has to kind of fall into financing networks and backbones that are illicit by nature, and if we want to kind of neutralize the ends of some of these efforts by our adversaries, we should really focus on their means of implementing their pursuing their objectives, and that's by going after the corruption network. So this could be an enabler across, frankly, a lot of the different activities that we want to achieve in U.S. with regards to the U.S. government vis-a-vis Russia, China, Iran, DPRK. If we neutralize or degrade the corruption networks that enable those regimes, we advance U.S. national security interests at large.
So I'm sure you're familiar as a soldier and a defense analyst with the phrase "it takes a network to defeat a network." That's been employed in the context of fighting terrorism. Do you think we are poised at this point both as the United States and in our strengthening partnership with Ukraine and with other countries in the region to, in effect, build a network that can face up to these transnational networks. And by that I mean not only government actors, but also civil society actors, professional groups. How do you feel that do you feel that's important, and how do you feel we measure up in that respect?
Yeah, it's definitely important. I fear that we fall short in this particular space. I think it does require a high level of interaction with NGOs and NGOs that operate in these non-permissive environments sometimes, and NGOs that are that are under acute threat. So we need to try to protect the enterprise as well as enable them to achieve their desired outcomes in terms of fighting corruption. I think there's a lack of resources with regards to partners at this point in time that kind of undermines the idea of the backbone for a network. I think we see that the early stages of the resolve to operate in the space that could then direct resources to provide the network, but we're still like one or two steps away, I think.
Yes, I agree with that, and I appreciate your perspective. You have a very rich perspective and diverse set of experiences to bring to this discussion, and I want to thank you. We are at the point where we have to adjourn, and I want to thank you. If you have any further comments you'd like to add, we'd be glad to hear them, of course.
I just want to applaud your efforts here. I think this is a critical project. There's a famous Zbigniew Brzezinski quote about the criticality of Ukraine to Russia, in which he says that Russia with Ukraine is automatically an empire. Absent Ukraine, it is not. And I think anti-corruption is probably, just as George Kent said, is probably about the most important activity as well as national defense that the Ukrainians can undertake, and anything we can do to help there would advance Ukrainian and definitely U.S. interests with regards to Euro-Atlantic stability. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, that's very great place to leave it, and of course we welcome your citation to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a great teacher at Columbia for many years, and his spirit lives on at the Harriman Institute as well. So again, thank you very much, sir, and good luck in your doctoral studies at Johns Hopkins.
Thank you.
So from Washington, D.C., we now go over to another continent, and we go to Kyiv itself. And it is my great pleasure to welcome for this next segment, today's forum, someone who, for many of you, will need no introduction, but we'll do it anyway. It's Daria Kaleniuk, who is the co-founder and the executive director at the Anti-Corruption Action Center, also known as UNTAC. There is a particular progression, I think, of the movement, this organization that Daria has founded through the Maidan Revolution of 2014, through changes in government, changes in U.S. administration, with the issue of corruption in and out of the news, both in Ukraine and abroad. I think one of the most compelling things that she does is not only does she zero in on many of these types of innovative institutions and advocate for them, but also provide an honest assessment of their strengths and weaknesses. She, I would say, is one of the leading interlocutors about global corruption that we have, who is able to explain with great clarity and precision the issues that Ukraine faces, but also the connections to other nodes, the transnational nodes we were just talking about that exist in places like Vienna, in London, in the United States. And so she is a figure, I think, that helps to bridge the the transnational side as well as the local side. So Daria, thanks so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be with us. It's nice to see you again. And really my first question asks you to put in perspective a little bit what we see in Ukraine at the moment. For over 8 years, your organization has advocated for many of the reforms that are being attempted now. If we were to come up with a scorecard of anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine and their state, what would that be for you? What should be looking for, and what are some of the challenges that are still remaining?
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for the invitation. My honor to be here with you. I'm not sure whether effectiveness of our anti-corruption work actually could be properly perceived by the broader audience. One of the core pillars of anti-corruption reform we were advocating in Ukraine after the Revolution of Dignity is improving transparency and creating tools and instruments to reveal and expose corruption. And many tools were developed in Ukraine, very innovative tools, which further we will be discussing during this forum with colleagues, like the public procurement system, Prozorro, the award-winning system, one of the best in the world. Then asset disclosure system of public officials. It's one of the most comprehensive also in the world. Ukraine was the first country in Europe to introduce public registry of beneficial ownership in our corporate registry. We've got e-data. This is the system where anyone can monitor the spending of public funds. So all these tools together create opportunity for citizens, for civil society, for investigative journalists to reveal and expose corruption, which is crucial, which is important. It is the first important step in fighting corruption. However, alone, this step is not contributing to the perception of public and of the audience that there is a progress. So people just get more information about corruption, which is from one side good because it harms those who are being exposed. But on the other side, people feel that there is more corruption. It doesn't mean that there is more corruption. That's important to know. And very interesting thing that it matters not only for Ukrainian public, it also matters for the world and the American public. Ukraine has been perceived probably among average Americans as the most corrupt country in the world, which is not true. The only reason it is being perceived like that is because we are actually fighting corruption and because there is progress, and because the stakes are so high. So this is the first pillar. Second pillar, and they have to be in parallel, it is creating institutions and tools to be able to prosecute corruption, to be able to punish. Exposing is not enough. Revealing alone is not enough. It creates, a feel of injustice if there will be no B. So you're telling A, but you're not telling B. There is feel of emptiness and injustice. Therefore, important second pillar of our strategy of fighting corruption in Ukraine is creating independent institutions able to collect evidence, package it into the cases, bring it to court, and then have the final, court decisions and verdicts. And it honestly is much harder than creating tools to expose and reveal corruption. Still, we have important progress here. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the investigative body, was set up. And this body has guarantees of independence. For 6 years of its work, actually almost 7, they are delivering cases, they are delivering results, they are targeting the most untouchable people in Ukraine, they're creating problem for them. However, this also doesn't help this agency to survive, because those people whom they are targeting, they are either oligarchs or people instrumental for oligarchs or some other, even external enemies like Russia. And then all these people, they have influenced our media. They control TV channels, they own TV channels. And they are using these TV channels to present to the broader audience, to Ukraine, that this National Anti-Corruption Bureau is doing wrong things, that it's a very bad agency, that it's not delivering nothing. However, it delivers. There is Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. There is High Anti-Corruption Court, actually a very unique tool, a unique institution, which we developed using the foreign experts participated in the selection of anti-corruption judges, and it proved to be effective. So altogether, these independent bodies, they pose threat to organized crime and corruption networks. As they are posing this threat, they are being under constant attack. And honestly, during the last 3 years, it's probably our major focus is to protect this anti-corruption framework from various attacks. And the second task which we have is to scale up what we have already achieved on successes in these two pillars to the broader agencies. Now we are focusing on judicial reform. It is instrumental, it is key. And in the case of Ukraine, we have learned that if judges are corrupt, if there is no judicial reform, then any reform can be cancelled just in a matter of a day. And this is what happened in October last year, when the Constitutional Court of Ukraine suddenly decided, with no explanation, with no legal background information, that the asset disclosure system in Ukraine is unconstitutional. And, and it was core for Ukraine-EU cooperation, Ukraine-IMF cooperation as a disclosure system. So it's in the core of the anti-corruption infrastructure in Ukraine. And that decision of the Constitutional Court attacks simultaneously anti-corruption infrastructure in Ukraine, but also the pro-Western, pro-Euro-Atlantic aspirations of Ukraine. And that's a vivid explanation how simply influencing 11 judges in the Constitutional Court, you can destroy Ukraine and some Ukrainian reforms from inside. Therefore, judicial reform is our next big idea, next big crucial reform, which is needed to provide justice for average Ukrainians, but also to protect all the progress we have achieved in Ukraine. And it's not easy to do so. I'm pretty sure that there will be more discussions during the day today on the situation with the judicial reform, but we have developed an idea, a solution, which I think is innovative not only for Ukraine, on how to make the judicial reform successful. And we are using the experience of the High Anti-Corruption Court, where foreign experts had a role in selection of judges. We are using this experience into the cleaning up the judicial self-governance bodies. We want foreign experts to be engaged in the, cleaning up judicial self-governance bodies. And this is something I believe, and I know, is very much of interest from countries like Moldova, for other countries in transition democracies which are struggling with the same, situation of reforming judiciary.
It's very interesting, and of course, this has also been experimentally tried in other countries regarding customs officials and involving foreign countries and expertise. You have covered so much, and I'm particularly struck analytically by a couple of things that you said. One is you very effectively showed us how in this context of anti-corruption networks, strategically targeting one node, in this case, the court, can have these ripple effects that destabilizes this entire infrastructure that you worked so hard to build. And it seems like the other side now is starting to acquire a laser-like precision in what to target and the maximum effect that they're going to target. The other thing that really struck me was your mention of the role of the media. See, this I think is quite counterintuitive to many anti-corruption activists everywhere, because we're used to thinking of the media, national media, investigative journalism as part of the anti-corruption network, one that highlights, exposes, disseminates information, holds to account. And what you're telling us is because of the oligarch control of the media, that sometimes it's the opposite that happens, that the media then gets involved in the pushback and the stigmatization of anti-corruption efforts. And I find that a really important takeaway from this proceeding. Now, I'm interested perhaps in any follow-up reactions you have, but I want to switch now to the outside-in perspective. I think it's fair to say that over the last 4 years here in the United States, we have learned more and more about corruption networks in Ukraine. First, I think through the Mueller probe and the investigation in some of the figures involved, especially the dealings of Paul Manafort under the Yanukovych government, as well as Gates's deputy. We learned a lot of the actions of US-based law firms in their PR relations and conduct. And of course, there were indictments for money laundering and for failing to disclose offshore assets related to those. And then, of course, the second big event was the impeachment, where we saw, again, under the hood, some of the transnational networks operations, the ties to Russia, how information and disinformation about corruption itself became a battlefield. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit from your perspective, how do you see Western, in particular, US understanding of their role or our role in facilitating these types of networks? Are we finally starting to get it? What are some of the notes of progress that you see on our side in tackling the types of issues that will facilitate your anti-corruption work? And what could we do better still on our side in terms of acknowledging and improving our role in the transnational sphere here?
Quick answer. There are extremely knowledgeable people and experts in the US, including governmental officials, who are getting it, who understand the problem, and who are trying to do everything possible to solve the problem of enablers in the US and in the West who are actually facilitating and helping and covering up these organized crime and corruption networks. But it's not in the mainstream politics yet in the US. And I think this, I fully agree with Alexander that these people and these agencies, they need more resources and more staff. And I hope actually that, this including corruption and weaponization of corruption into the national security threat will hopefully get more resources for them. So I'm optimistic about the US. I like that, the dynamics there. I'm less optimistic about the European Union and EU member states. So I don't sense and don't feel and don't see any signs of understanding and realizing that corruption is actually the national security threat, and that corruption and geopolitical weaponized corruption is a threat to the Union, to the European Union. I don't see that. I see a person responsible for disinformation. I see that climate change is very on top of the issues, but nothing about corruption as a weapon, and which is used actually to attack the European Union. But from perspective of Ukraine, it's very visible how EU as a union, as the union of very wealthy and successful democracy is being attacked and weakened and weaponized, is being attacked by corruption. What could be done? What else could be done? And how important are these enablers and access to Western law firms, PR agencies, financial institutions for corruption to thrive in countries like Ukraine. Honestly, if there was no international element, if there was no access to these resources for organized crime and corruption networks and oligarchs, if the problem was only inside Ukraine, I'm pretty sure that we Ukrainians would have already solved this problem. But when we are close to success, when we are effective, we see how actually, how it is going into the geopolitics. We see how Russia is using corruption to intimidate Ukraine and to prevent Ukraine from being a rich country. And we see how Ukrainian oligarchs are using their resources, pouring their resources into the financial system on the West in order to be able to protect their reputation, to protect their money put outside of Ukraine, and even attack us and attack institutions in Ukraine. Alexander mentioned Viktor Medvedchuk, one of the pro-Russian, pro-Russian politician. I'm very happy that Volodymyr Zelensky sanctioned him and sanctioned the media empire he had. But he actually registered in asset declaration on his wife 98 companies. 44 of them were registered in Cyprus, and in the UK and in other countries on the West. So these people need access to the West in order to move money and to get money, in this case, from Russian oil and pour it back to Ukraine into anti-Western and anti-Ukrainian activities. So what could be done? There has to be a synergy between US and European Union, UK and Switzerland. I hope that there will be leadership from the US to shake up and to wake up the European Union. Listen, guys, come on. It's national security threat in the US. It's also a threat to you. It's actually a threat to democracy. Corruption is a hybrid threat to democracy. And we are in one boat. We have to put efforts together. We have to, if we are sanctioning bad guys, let's do that together. Let's improve the EU sanctioning mechanism. If we are banning visa and try, let's say for oligarch Kolomoisky, let's do it together. Let's ban visa and try also for the EU member states, for Switzerland, for the UK. And I'm sure that the same approach could be very much, supported by pro-democracy movements in Russia. I care about these people. I care about Alexei Navalny. I care about Mr. Kara-Murza and other pro-Russian, pro-democracy people in Russia who are fighting for their country, for a chance to build a good country. And their key message to the West is, listen, guys, Kremlin already integrated to the EU. All the assets are kept there. Moscow is integrated in the US. Look in Florida. So please don't accept this money. Don't accept them. Ban and try for their family members. This is the best help for pro-democracy movements in Russia. And the same actually for Ukraine.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of our time, but this has been a really enlightening conversation. And I think this forward-looking recommendation of closer coordination, especially using some of the anti-corruption tools like the visa bans and the travel bans, the awareness of reputational laundering in both phases, and the sort of a prod to our European colleagues to elevate this to both a national security issue, but a broader kind of democracy issue. So Daria, thank you again for joining us today. Good luck with all of the fine work that you do, and we look forward to catching up and hearing your progress in some of our forums to come. Thank you again. And now,
thank you, Alex. Just a final message from me. Actually, we will continue this conversation on strategic corruption as a threat to democracy in Ukraine, in Kyiv, on June 7-8. We will host a forum, the Zero Corruption, Democracy and Action Conference. So I'm inviting everyone. It will be in the hybrid format. I will disseminate the link. You could register.
Perfect. Yes, if you could put the link in the chat box, then everyone can see it. We will also include it with our report for the event. So yes, thank you for that. We look forward to that. So now we move to an analysis from a group of experts who have been heavily engaged with one of these innovative tools. It's innovations in the area of public procurement and the Prozorro electronically based system of public procurement. So it is a great pleasure to introduce Tatiana Lisovska, who is the e-procurement team lead for USAID and UK's AIDS Transparency and Accountability in Public Administration and Services activity, along with Robert O'Donovan, who's the vice president of the Eurasia Foundation. And they welcome to you both. And I believe they have, the floor is yours. They have a PowerPoint briefing on Prozorro and its operations. So Tatiana and Robert, the floor is yours.
Wonderful, thanks. I really appreciate the kind introduction, Alex. Why don't I start the presentation? Just give me a quick moment here. I just want to confirm that you can see that. Yes? And I'll start the slideshow.
Looks good.
Great. Okay, again, my name is Rob O'Donovan. I'm the Vice President of Programs at the Eurasia Foundation. Since 2016, the Eurasia Foundation has implemented the transparency and accountability in public services and administration activity in Ukraine. And this is a project that has a title that's quite a mouthful. So we just refer to it as the TAPAS project for short. And with support from USAID and UK Aid, TAPAS has helped accelerate the public procurement reform in Ukraine, including the Prozorro electronic procurement system. So today, with my colleague Tatiana, she and I would like to share with you a bit about the background of Prozorro and its impact on public procurement. So I'd like to begin by just quickly putting Ukraine's public procurement reform in recent historical context. The broad push to combat corruption in Ukraine's government, including the reform of the public procurement system, emerged from the Maidan protests in 2013 and 2014. After the government of Viktor Yanukovych fell in early 2014, teams of reformers across many areas began working, including changing the public procurement system. The reform teams were often comprised of young people drawn from the business and nonprofit sectors who were determined to see greater openness and effectiveness from their government. At the time when the idea for Prozorro, the e-procurement system, emerged, public procurement was synonymous with corruption in Ukraine. I'd like to share just a few figures with you to give you the sense of the scale of the problem. Like many economies, public procurement represents a significant portion of Ukraine's GDP. For Ukraine, the proportion varies year to year, of course, but on average, it's about 15 to 20% of the country's GDP. In 2014, Ukraine's GDP was about $134 billion, and the total value of public procurement was approximately $21.5 billion, or 16% of GDP that year. Conservative estimates put the corruption tax, in other words, the losses due to corruption on public procurement at least 10%. And there are, of course, innumerable corruption schemes in public procurement. Typical schemes included kickbacks, announcing tenders on extremely short timelines, defining the tender so that only one company was eligible, and many, many others. Another 10% was regularly lost to low or non-existent competition. Before the e-procurement system was introduced, a public buyer would announce tenders using a complicated paper-based tender system. Larger suppliers who had departments dedicated to handling all of the paperwork, the paper-based bids, with all of the appropriate certifications and so forth that were needed, had a distinct advantage over small and medium-sized enterprises. The paper-based approach also excluded many SMEs from even bidding on public contracts, and of course created opportunities for improper payments. And of course, with lower competition, larger firms would set higher prices, and public buyers often would have no choice but to award a contract at a higher price, thus taking a loss. So the context for the public procurement reform. In 2014, the reform team that was bent on changing the public procurement system proposed a new electronic procurement system. The new e-procurement system was initially developed not by the government, which is super interesting, but rather by a leading NGO, Transparency International. Transparency International Ukraine developed a minimum viable product and was authorized by the government to pilot the new e-procurement system with a limited set of small-scale public procurements. The e-procurement system was called Prozorro, or transparent in Ukrainian. The pilot phase demonstrated that the e-procurement system worked, so ownership of the new system was transferred to the Ministry of Economic Development, Trade, and Agriculture. And day-to-day operations of the system today are managed by a state-owned company set up by the ministry, which is also called Prozorro. After the transfer, the ministry and state-owned enterprise Prozorro took the system to scale. And on August 1st, 2016, all public procurements were legally required to be tendered through the electronic system, through the Prozorro system. I'd like to say just a few words about the ecosystem around this reform. A nice way to refer to it is the e-procurement golden triangle. The Prozorro team adopted and promoted this golden triangle approach where the government, private sector, and civil society work together to promote reform in public procurement. In the golden triangle ecosystem, the Ministry of Economic Development, Trade, and Agriculture is responsible to set public procurement policy for all public sector buyers across Ukraine, including central ministries, municipal governments, schools, and hospitals, all public buyers. The ministry is also responsible to identify education priorities for strengthening the public procurement profession and to work closely with training providers, such as the Kyiv School of Economics, to strengthen the delivery and ensure strong delivery of high quality training for the profession. State-owned enterprise Prozorro is responsible to administer the back-end database of the electronic procurement system and store all procurement data. Interestingly, and this is something that I'll touch on in a little bit more detail shortly, the private sector is represented by commercial platforms that are authorized to directly interact with state-owned enterprise Prozorro. In Ukraine, there are about 24 companies that, one, assist public buyers with announcing their tenders and help suppliers submit bids in response to those tenders. The commercial platforms do not charge public buyers, but they do charge a small fee, typically less than 1% of the contract value, to suppliers for each tender that they bid on. The commercial platforms have been very successful in helping small and medium-sized businesses enter the market for public contracts. The commercial platforms assist suppliers with analyzing tender documentation, preparing formal questions in response to tenders, and other activities. And of course, the commercial platforms widely promote new tenders because it's in their business interest. Their business model depends on many suppliers submitting bids. Lastly, civil society plays a critical role in offering civic oversight of the public procurement system. And I've noted here Transparency International Ukraine's logo again. But there are others, of course, that are involved in this process. And I'll touch briefly on how civil society oversight of the public procurement system works in just a few moments. So I'd like to touch briefly on just how the system works, so that it maybe pull back the curtain here a little bit on on the magic of Prozorro, so to speak. So let's say a procuring entity, a public buyer, such as a school, a hospital, or a central ministry, needs to buy goods, services, or create public works like a road or build a building. The public buyer drafts and publishes a tender through one of the commercial platforms or marketplaces. And the commercial platform sends the tender to the Prozorro central database. And the purpose there is to then, from the database, it is in turn published. They publish the tender on all of the commercial platforms. So they're seen across all of the 24 companies that serve this role. On the other side, interested suppliers work with the commercial platform, one that they feel is giving them good service, to identify tenders that are of interest to their company. They prepare their respective bids and they submit them through their preferred commercial platform. After the application deadline, then firms go through a reverse auction. Every bidder and outside observers can see all of the price offers. The reverse auction goes through 3 rounds, and the firm that offers the lowest price is selected as the winner. And there are 2 key points here that I want to highlight. First, all of the tender data is submitted using the Open Contracting Data Standard, and it is publicly available in machine-readable format. This approach ensures that anyone, a business competitor, an NGO, a media outlet, an oversight agency, has easy access to the tender information, and thus everyone sees everything. The fact that everyone sees everything has an impact on both public buyers and suppliers, especially when they know that outside parties may very well choose to take a look at a particular tender. Second, the reverse auction process almost always generates savings for the public buyer. Like government contracts in many countries, Ukraine's tenders include a price estimate, and the auction process among bidders typically results in a winning offer that is approximately 10% on average less than the contract's estimated value. So again, I'd like to, as I mentioned, just touch on quickly the role of civil society in the oversight process. After Transparency International Ukraine assisted the ministry with creating the Prozorro e-procurement system, TI Ukraine shifted back to a more traditional role, watchdog role, for a civil society organization. In January 2017, TI Ukraine launched the Prozorro network. Prozorro means watchdog in Ukrainian. The Prozorro network is comprised of 25 NGOs and hundreds of volunteers who actively monitor public procurement on Prozorro. Using highly sophisticated analytical IT tools and the open data generated in the Prozorro system, the Prozorro network monitors thousands of public tenders and identifies high-risk, in other words, likely corrupt tenders. When they identify a high-risk tender, the Prozorro team then notifies government oversight agencies like the State Audit Service, the Accounting Chamber, or prosecutors' offices. Their oversight function has been effective in holding corrupt public purchasers to account. Since January 2017, the Prozorro network has identified more than 37,800 high-risk tenders. And after they dug in and took a close look at these tenders, just over 35,000 high-risk tenders were brought to the attention of public purchasers and their oversight authorities through formal complaints. After reviewing the complaints, over 9,000 of these complaints resulted in wins. That is, tenders that were canceled or substantially amended by the public purchasers, or illegal tender decisions were reversed. So you might notice, okay, 9,100 wins represent only about a quarter of the formal appeals that were filed. Often public purchasers or the state audit service or other government oversight agencies don't react. But the civic oversight function is still really important, especially when you consider the value of those wins. The 9,100 wins that have a total value of approximately $906 million, which is not a small sum, and it's something really to pay attention to. So I'd like to highlight some of the results that the Prozorro system has generated over the 5 years, since it formally began launched its operations. Over 9 million procurement procedures with a total value of more than $164 billion have been administered through the system. And more than 51,000 public buyers are now registered in Prozorro. Just as importantly, nearly 400,000 suppliers, vendors, businesses have registered in the system as well. The number of suppliers has steadily climbed as trust in the e-procurement system has grown in the private sector. As a quick data point, in September 2018, there were 188,000 registered suppliers. So then since September of 2018, the number of businesses registered in the system has more than doubled. Importantly, the collective savings for the government of Ukraine for using the Prozorro system has now climbed to $6 billion, or roughly $1 billion a year. And I want to talk a little bit about how that's calculated. The savings are the accumulation of the difference between the value of a state buyer's estimate for a given contract and the actual value of the contract once it goes through the Prozorro reverse auction process. In most cases, the value of the winning bid is lower, as I mentioned earlier, the value of the winning bid is lower than with an average difference of about 10%. So here's just a quick photo of the Prozorro team from the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade and Agriculture and the state-owned enterprise Prozorro. And with this, I'd like to turn the floor quickly over to my colleague, Tatiana, who will tell you about a recent innovation in the public procurement system, namely Prozorro Market. So Tatiana.
Thank you, Rob. It is a pleasure to be here today with you and to have an opportunity to introduce Ukraine's experience in public procurement sphere. And I tell you about the new and innovative instrument in public procurement system. Is called Prozorro Market. It was piloted in 2019 and scaled up in 2020. And this is a platform for quick and easy purchase of standard goods like furniture, stationery, medical supplies, and others. And it works like an Amazon. And the system is based on the used experience principle almost in all online stores today. It's like browse, click, and buy. And Prozorro Market is the first state-owned online store and is used for the purchase of under the threshold goods that was less than $10,000. And how it works, it's administered by the two central procurement bodies, namely State Institutional Professional Procurement and State-Owned Enterprise Medical Procurement of Ukraine. And they're responsible to qualify suppliers, verify their all tender documents, create categories, and describe technical requirements to the product. At the same time, contracting authorities just choose the goods in the Prozorro Market and give the contract to the supplier. And the use of Prozorro Market for contracting authority is free of charge, and suppliers should pay some small fee. The main aim of the Prozorro Market is to simplify the process of purchasing the small batches of standard goods and attract more small and medium business to the public procurement market. And in 2020, shopping via e-catalogs tool became an official alternative to the simplified procedure for the below the threshold procurement in Prozorro system. And during the pandemic, I would like to admit that we saw the significant increase of purchasing medical products, including COVID-19 related products and others through e-catalogs, and the saving of buying from Prozorro market are substantial. For example, the average saving on the purchasing of the protective mask in Prozorro is 69%. And I also would like to emphasize that from my perspective, Prozorro market is a really great tool that helps to bought medical goods. And then another case that I would like to tell you that for 2 weeks ago, the executive committee of Yuzhny Ukraine City Council decided to purchase a protective mask for Prozorro market, and 16 vendors responded to the city council request. And as a result, the executive committee purchased 3 late protective masks only for 0.62 Ukrainian hryvnias a piece, while the average price for protective mask under the coronavirus procedure is more than 3 times that. It is 2.2 hryvnia a piece. And I would like to note that Prozorro market is growing rapidly. And for today, we have 1,000 suppliers registered in Prozorro market, 2,000 contracting authorities, and currently in Prozorro market presents 4,000 goods in 500 categories. And the value of goods bought through Prozorro market exceeds $5.7. And as I mentioned earlier, Prozorro market opens a new and great opportunities for small and medium companies. And I'd like to share the story of private entrepreneur Vadim Kadachivov, who...
Anna, I just want to point out we have a hard stop in 2 minutes. So if you could give us that story.
Okay, I almost finished.
Thank you.
Okay, I understood. So I have only 2 minutes, but okay. I'll describe the story of the Vadim Kadachivov. He produced the protective equipment, and he moved through in 2014 from Sevastopol to Kiev and became the volunteer helping army. And also he founded several enterprises who produce uniform. And so then the pandemic started. Vadim have enough production capacity to start produce protective equipment. The only issue was to whom sell these products. And at the same time, the central procurement body is filling up medical goods in the Prozorro market, and they were looking for suppliers. So Vadim and others were invited, and as a result, for the 7 months of cooperation with Prozorro market, Vadim's company received more than $895,000, and I think that it's a very good result for a startup just entered the market and starting producing personal protective equipment. And this is only one of success cases related to the Prozorro. And continue talking about the success, I also would like to mention that public procurement reform in Ukraine has also gained international recognitions and awards. And so in 2016, Prozorro received an Open Government Partnership Golden Award for Transparency. At the same year, Prozorro has also been recognized a leading public procurement reform by procurement leaders, London-based procurement associations, and Eurasia Foundation also supports the e-procurement reform through our TAPAS program. And in October 2020, TAPAS received a Digital Development Award for accelerating the public procurement reform through use and expansion of innovating digital tools. And just today, we received this award. And so I would like to thank you for inviting us and to have the opportunity to speak today with you. And we are open for any question you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would encourage audience members who have questions or queries to use the Q&A function or contact Robert and Tatiana. So we are at time. We've stolen 5 minutes from the agenda, which isn't too bad, but we do recognize that we want to keep within the boundaries of what we have there. So we will break until 10:40, but I want to just emphasize part B of our program is in a separate webinar. You should have received links to both. So please, when you rejoin at 10:40, rejoin under Part B. The link to that is in the chat right here if you would like to cut and paste that in your browser and be ready to go. But I want to thank you, Robert. I want to thank you, Tatiana, for fleshing out just the extraordinary progress and vision behind this, and just the scope of what it's managed to be done here on reforming public procurement through Prozorro and then the monitoring mechanism afterwards. So on the other side, we will continue. See you all at 10:40. Thanks so much.